Okay, everybody, welcome back to Blogging Heads. Today I'm with Professor Robert Farley of the Patterson School at the University of Kentucky and a contributor to the American Prospect. How you doing today, Robert? Oh, and I'm Eli Lake, I should say.
What's that?
I am Eli Lake. How are you?
Oh, I am very well.
Okay, well, listen, let's start off with Iowa. Today is January 4th, which is, we've now seen the results. What do you think this means for the war in our American foreign policy?
What do I think it means for American foreign policy? Is that the question?
Correct.
Yeah. I really don't know what it means for American foreign policy because I don't really have a... on some sense, you have to see it, especially on the Republican side, as a bit of a rejection of what you would call, I don't know, neoconservative or Bush administration foreign policy. I mean, it's not like Mike Huckabee's exactly been very forthright, but I think he has come out on a couple of occasions and suggested that that the Bush administration isn't really the foreign policy path that he's planning to take. And in terms of Obama, on the other side, I mean, yeah, I really don't know how much of a contribution we're talking about here in terms of, I mean, obviously it's his first vote, or his opposition to the war in the first place that makes him, and it's not the only thing that makes him an important candidate, but it's an important contributor to his candidacy. But that said, I mean, he's been much less vocal than John Edwards has about pulling out of Iraq. So, I don't know what exactly message that sends on the Democratic side.
Well, Obama, in fact, has said that as the facts on the ground has changed, his position on what to do had changed as well. And I think, Edwards is... if Edwards was a movie, he would be Say Anything, I think, because he has said just about everything if you go back far enough. But Edwards, in his foreign affairs piece, made it pretty clear that he would leave, I think, some troops in Iraq, and then he's saying, he would get them all out, and I think it depends on the audience that he's talking to, and he did. I think you'd have to say it was a pretty disappointing draw for John Edwards, and Obama brought a lot of enthusiasm and young people to the polls, much to his credit. And I think it should be said, obviously, that it's very important for this country that an African American would win in a state as white as Iowa in the caucuses, and I think that's a very good thing. So, I mean, it's something that we can all be happy about. And I guess coming from the conservative side, I think it's really interesting because conservatives have thought that Hillary was so inevitable. Sean Hannity called his radio show the Stop Hillary Express. And there's this sort of view, I think, among conservatives that, the Clintons are so venal and corrupt that there's no way they would allow another Clinton to lose this process. And I think now she looks finally very vulnerable. Now, I never necessarily thought that, but I did think that I still think Bill Clinton is the most talented politician of his era. And I still think that she presents a real, I still wouldn't count her out, and I actually would still consider her the front runner.
Right. I mean, I think that irrelevant what happens in New Hampshire, that this on both ends, or on both sides, the election is going to go for a little while. But I mean, going back to setting aside the Clinton mojo and what exactly they can do or don't, I think that progressives were a little bit less. I think there was a point at which, even most progressives in the blogosphere said, yeah, Clinton is probably going to do it. But I think that took a lot longer, and I think it disintegrated a lot faster on the progressive, or that belief deteriorated a lot faster on the left side, as Obama picked up speed in both New Hampshire and in Iowa. And so the belief in Clinton inevitability was not as strongly held. I think it was held for a little while, but it wasn't as strongly held on the left as it was on the right. Perhaps because we don't really think of the Clintons in terms of sort of the power of their mojo machine.
Yeah, I know. And but here's an interesting question for the Obama crowd, and one that I've been looking into, writing about in the next week or so. Among Obama's the Obama crowd. Among Obama's advisors, Samantha Power, who wrote, the book on preventing genocides after Rwanda from a policy perspective. Philip Gurevich wrote, I think, the book, the indispensable book in terms of chronicling that genocide. But it was Samantha Powers who really said, okay, what does this mean in terms of what the U.S. should do as the sort of the remaining hyperpower or superpower? And so she's the oldest advisor that we know of to Barack Obama. And yet, the people who were responsible for doing nothing, like Tony Lake, and to a lesser degree Susan Rice, are also very senior foreign policy advisors for Obama. And it's really unclear because Obama himself has talked about, probably been further than any of the candidates in either party about doing something about Darfur. Right. And clearly he seems to be very well aware of the lessons of neglect and betrayal from Rwanda. Right. And yet here he is with Tony Lake and Susan Rice, who in some ways were very much responsible for at least the American policy. Now that's not getting Hillary off the hook. Madeleine Albright, of course, was at the UN as the American ambassador there. So she certainly has a big role in that, and her husband, of course, as well. So it's not necessarily saying that that's good for Hillary, but it is interesting because I think it's a kind of contradiction within the Obama campaign.
Right. Well, I think one lesson we should take from this is that Rudy Giuliani's campaign is not a model in terms of the sort of the ideological comedy among advisors, right? I mean, all of Rudy's advisors believe more or less the same. I mean, that's a little bit of a
I would not agree with that.
Yeah, did you read Mike Desch's American Conservative piece that came out?
I did read the Mike Desch American Conservative piece, and I disagreed very much with it. I mean, I think that there in the Rudy camp, the real player there is Dr. Charles Hill, who he signed the some of the PNAC letters, but at the same, I mean, that's the Project for a New American Century, and those were the letters that were calling for the invasion of Iraq. But he comes from, he was the executive assistant to Secretary of State Schultz. He worked with Boutros Ghali. And he really does look at a foreign policy for the U.S., and he sees it sort of forward-looking and saying, how can the U.S. be the guarantor of the international system? I think that there is a strain within neoconservatism that looks at the international system as just sort of another hindrance on American power. And in that respect, those two positions are not necessarily, in harmony with one another, though I would say that I think all neoconservatives would see the necessity of serious reforms to the United Nations, but they wouldn't necessarily agree on what role an international system should be in terms of limiting American power.
Well, I mean, you're seeing a lot more space than I am, but I think the overall point is that in Obama's campaign you find a lot of people who are committed to some vision of liberal internationalism, right? And I think that the Clinton campaign is broadly committed to maybe a slightly more, and I don't know what the term I'm looking for here is, a forceful vision of liberal internationalism. But I think the Clinton and Obama's, that their campaigns are relatively close in terms of their foreign policy outlooks. And I think that setting the Obama voting against the war aside, I think there would be very little light or very little space in which to distinguish between Clinton and Obama. But and I guess this gets back to your original question too. How much does this actually matter to Iowa primary voters or Iowa caucus voters and New Hampshire primary voters? And it's not clear to me that anything that Edwards or Clinton or Obama or Huckabee on the right side are saying was really critical to what happened yesterday. It doesn't seem to me that foreign policy was a determinant of who won that caucus.
Yeah, I mean, on the Republican side, I think that Huckabee is very much a tabula rasa, and we'll see modifications of his view if he becomes indeed the nominee or the frontrunner. Right. Over time, he'll probably iron a few things out and probably take a few things back. This is a great kind of segue because when you talk about Obama and Hillary, and I think that those are the two choices really right now emerging for the Democrats, I think you really have to say, yet again, a string of political losses, the latest in a string of political losses for the Netroots, who I think have put forth a kind of vision of foreign policy that has neither taken hold in the U.S. Congress. Congress failed to end the war that they said that they had to, and I think it's also failed to take hold in the candidates, the two major candidates from the Democratic Party. So it's at a certain point, maybe I don't know what necessarily the future of the Netroots is, but I think the only place where they've really won is in a kind of tone and rhetoric, but nothing approaching what would be the kind of foreign policy vision that might follow from some of the posters that you would read on a Daily Kos, or for that matter, I guess some of the sort of new liberal Netroots bloggers like Matthew Iglesias.
Right, and to the extent that you can, derive a specific position out of the Netroots, and the Netroots, of course, is really big and has a lot of different positions in it. At some point, and it was between 2005 and 2006, within the lefty blogosphere, sort of arguing for the Pottery Barn rule became no longer acceptable. And in my own case, I had held to the Pottery Barn rule until maybe 2005. I don't even remember when I changed my mind. But I also changed my mind and became pro-withdrawal at some point. And it is interesting that even though respectable opinion in the lefty blogosphere is now sort of very much in tune with a Chris Dodd or a Kucinich or a John Edwards view of what should be done in Iraq, that, and I'm looking around today at some of these sites, I'm not seeing a lot of disappointment, I'm not seeing a lot of displeasure that Obama won this. In fact, it seems like a lot of people are really enthusiastic, and maybe that's because of Obama's other characteristics. And maybe what that just says is that the Netroots lefty blogosphere is a little bit more flexible on these questions than some of the rhetoric suggests that it is. The rhetoric is very absolutist in sort of how it's being carried out, but when you look at what the major bloggers are saying, they seem to be a little bit more flexible.
Well, I think that they've kind of gone through various iterations. Mm-hmm. There was a period when the Netroots were obsessed with the deception of the neoconservative policymakers in the administration, sort of promoting this line that they pressured the intelligence and are responsible for this big lie. And then the flip side of that would have been that, the rest of the intelligence community, in fact, knew that Saddam didn't have the arsenal that the president and Colin Powell and others sort of claimed. And I think that, with over time, we've sort of seen that that's not right. Maybe we could call that the sort of Joe Wilson view of the lead up to the war, that's not exactly at all what happened. In fact, Curveball was a German asset who was given to the CIA. The Office of Special Plans had very little to do with it. The Colin Powell speech was deliberately vetted by Tenet and the bureaucratic enemies of the neoconservatives. So some of the stuff about how the neocons were this cabal within the government that had sort of cast aside the judgment of the CIA has shifted now that more information has come out, and now especially that we see that the CIA has destroyed evidence that was sought by the 9/11 Commission with regards to interrogation, and I think you're seeing a lot less sympathy for the CIA, and it's sort of left them in just sort of saying, well, I don't like the war, let's just get out.
Right.
Iran is not a threat, and it's sort of just, I think it's become a kind of, it's incoherent in a way, because I would say that there was a moment where people who were very upset and critical of the war and critical of the neoconservative philosophy were in the Dick Clark camp, who said, there are serious threats. Al-Qaeda really is a very serious threat. Now, I'm not saying it's a mainstream position, but there are certain things I've read at times in the Netroots that sort of suggest that people are saying Al-Qaeda is just a big lie. You know what I'm saying? So it kind of is. It's all over the place right now, and I don't necessarily know where it's going. And maybe that's one reason why you haven't seen a major candidate really pick up and run with it.
Right, and I think we'll get back to this a little bit when we talk about. I think we're going to talk a little bit about locution and the war on terror. But here's the thing about the CIA in particular. Some of my colleagues are retired CIA, so I actually do hold the CIA in fairly high esteem. But the Netroots never liked the CIA as much as the neocons hated the CIA. Right. The Netroots, and this is unsurprising given the long history of the relationship of the left with the CIA. I myself always just thought it was sort of fascinating watching neoconservatives and their sympathizers describe the CIA as a neo-communist organization that was a likely shot through with Islamists or so forth. Right. That. There's not a mirror here in the sense that some leftists understand the CIA for what it is, which is a professional intelligence organization that does what professional intelligence organizations do. But none of them, I don't think, hold it in a particularly high esteem, and so I don't see much of a contradiction then between saying, listen, that the CIA came under a lot of pressure, and whether you want to believe the the most aggressive version of the story in which things were manufactured from whole cloth, or I think the much more plausible professional story in which this is what bureaucratic organizations do, and their executives can push them in particular directions, can push them to particular outcomes. But in all of those, I think that leftists understood that the CIA was just a group of professionals and not, not a set of heroes who were going to keep us out of the war.
Well, it's interesting. I would say this. I'm not speaking for anyone but myself, but I think that I think we need a CIA, especially to fight Al Qaeda. But I think they have an institutional bias in the following sense: that the CIA has developed liaison relationships with the security services of Arab and sort of autocratic regimes in the Arab and Islamic world, and that they saw after 9/11, as did people like Flint Leverett and many people in the State Department and the Foreign Service, that the way to win the overall global war was invade Afghanistan, where we knew Al Qaeda was, but more importantly, redouble and double down our relationships with these the security services of these autocratic regimes. Now, this is a little bit off topic, but I think we should sort of approach it. But there's going to be, I think, for the for many on the netroots right now, there really is, I think, going to have to be a reckoning on this point, because that carries with it the policy of rendition. It carries with it indirect rendition to places where they torture people, and they torture lots of innocent people. And the question is, do you think that those relationships that we've had really since the Cold War, since the beginning of the Cold War, will sustain from a practical perspective? And do you think it's any more ethical or moral to rely on security services to torture terrorists or suspected terrorists than it is to have them in a black site? So I think that these are. I think that the more and more we sort of see or learn about what we really were doing with all of our allies, as it were, in the Middle East, in the Bush administration, the less and less I think that they will kind of get as much of a pass as I've seen them get from the left.
Right, and I guess I still don't see them as really getting a pass from the left on these issues. I guess that's our point of dispute. I don't think that the left is interested or really has given the CIA a pass. I think they, like I said, they appreciate, or a lot of people on the left anyway, appreciate the professionalism in the CIA. Hold
on a second, Robert, if I could. Okay, there was a storyline in 2004 about Ahmed Chalabi, about how he was the worst possible oppositionist to power in Iraq, and it benefited the one person in the bureaucratic debate, Ayad Alawi, that the CIA very much wanted. And you can kind of go back to there was a view that it was much more accepted, not just among the bloggers, but among journalists, that it was the neocons who pressured and manufactured intelligence. That was happening during the greatest reorganization of the intelligence community that we'd seen since 1948. And the beneficiaries of that reorganization, as we now know, were basically people in the CIA, after border costs, of course, and the State Department. Whereas what I'm saying is that there's a lot of blame to go around, and I'm not saying the neocons are necessarily blameless, though they were ascribed an awful lot of that over and over again in this sort of campaign to talk about the neocons on the netroots, and it's sort of, cui bono, who benefited, It was the CIA. So while maybe the people weren't writing, in praise of Cofer Black, they certainly were benefiting the kind of Cofer Black side of the internal dispute within the Bush administration.
Sure, but just because two sets of people were going in the same direction doesn't mean they were traveling in the same car. It doesn't mean that they were had a mutual admiration society.
Right.
I just don't buy the connection here between. I think that the connection between the CIA and the netroots is much less distinct than you suggest.
I don't know. A lot of former CIA officials like Larry Johnson and Valerie Plame are providing kind of the testimony against the nemesis.
Right, and there are a lot of CIA officials who have very distinct views or very different views on this. And I know a few of the CIA people, and and maybe they're not as public in what they're vocalizing, but they just the person in the next office from me has a very a view of foreign policy that's very much at odds with the netroots, and I think the netroots that's unsurprising to the netroots.
Yeah, no, I think, by the way, over time, it's less so in 2008 and 2007 than it was in 2005. But there was definitely a moment. It was a little weird. All right, but let's if we should probably move on to what we talked about before, which is the locution. Unless, do you want to yell at me about my email to David Frum?
Yeah. Why don't I yell? How many? And this is in reference.
Okay.
This is in reference to you wrote an email to David Frum suggesting that did you say most or half of the leftist blogosphere was frustrated?
I don't remember exactly what I said,
Right.
but can I just, if I could say, there's a difference between what I would write for publication and an email to my friend David Frum, who then put it on his blog. I had no idea how many people in the Netroots read David Frum's blog. I'm delighted. But anyway, I just did a
Google search for Eli Lake, and it came up.
There you go. It was like one of the first things. Should I summarize it? I said that the Netroots were mostly literary theory professors in their pajamas, and they represented like 1% of the American population, and they would never. I was having some fun, and I don't exactly. Obviously, I have no evidence to suggest that most people who are in the Netroots community are literary theory professors, or for that matter, hardened Marxists, or for that matter, wear pajamas. I don't know any of that. It was just a joke. And it was an email, and I mean, I kind of, people took it very seriously. What I would just say is, my point was, I thought that a lot of where they were coming from, particularly how they framed the Iraq War stuff, was not in the mainstream of how Americans saw it. Americans, I think, didn't want to stick around for a war they thought they couldn't win, that we couldn't win. Mm-hmm. But they did not take the view. I think that some of the ones that we were like the Lancet survey, and there's a lot of stuff that you sort of circulates on the left that, kind of comes very close to calling the car bombers and, beheaders a resistance, and sort of draws a moral equivalence between our soldiers and
there's some of that stuff.
So I was saying, I just think that that's like a minority position, not to mention diluted.
Well, sure, and whenever you create something, a social unit that looks like a blogosphere, whether on the right or the left, you are going to, especially when the links between them are so often so weak, you are going to create sort of and I think everybody, is a resonance chamber and so forth.
Right.
But what interested me about that, about your statement, was that, my experience of the blogosphere is that there are a lot of professor types. There are a lot of PhDs, and my blog, for example, we have 3 or 4 PhDs who write for Lawyers, Guns, and Money, and then Tom Schaller is a PhD in political science, and then Duncan Black of Atrios is an economics PhD, and Josh Marshall.
Duncan Black's an economics PhD?
Yeah. I
Get out of here. Really?
Pretty sure. I could be wrong about that.
Okay, I didn't know. I had no idea. All right.
Yeah, Duncan Black, Josh Marshall.
That's right. I know
Brad
Josh.
DeLong.
By the way, here's a shocker. Josh Marshall and Eli Lake are friends.
That doesn't surprise me at all.
No, I'm just saying.
No shock.
We've had parties with with an interesting crowd.
No, I'm friends with John Noonan, who's one of the guys who writes for Op4 and a few other places.
Yeah.
But this was the interesting thing to me based on the quote. Everybody that I can think of that Crooked Timber and Duck Merriman, it's a lot of social science PhDs who write in the lefty blogosphere, and Juan Cole and Mark Lynch and so forth. Yeah. And so that's why I found your characterization kind of interesting. These are not literary theory types, and maybe they blog in their pajamas. And
I did find out that
some of them will fail down the road.
One of them is Empty Wheel.
Empty Wheel, is that a literary theory?
Marcy Wheeler of Empty Wheel, who went bonkers for Joe Wilson and so forth, and just had to convict Scooter Libby, was a literary theory person. And she wrote an interesting entry about it, which I remember, which said, at one point, in fact, we wear Prada and leather or something like that. Like, we don't wear pajamas. Come on. And I'm like, all right, it was just a joke. As a blogger, wear pajamas.
Right. And that's
anyway,
yes,
I accept that there's a wide variety of very overeducated bloggers who cover the waterfront of the various academic disciplines.
Right. But it's not trivial in terms of the content either. I would say that if you read Juan Cole, you read Mark Lynch, they tell you a lot about what's going on in their areas of specificity, right? And that's why I work for the American Prospect, because I do this too. So. But anyway, we should move on to locution.
Okay, locution. Okay. So one of the bugaboos of the net left is the term Islamic fascism, and I'm not here necessarily to defend Islamic fascism today, Because
I expected a vigorous defense of Islamic fascism from you.
No. I'm
a very pro-fascist
curveball.
position and Islamic from you. That's what I thought you were going to say.
No. Let me explain. I don't necessarily have the same problems with Islamic fascism that I've seen in some of the criticisms of it. But I've thought a lot about it, and I actually think that the correct term for our enemies is Islamic supremacists. And if I could, I'll just explain it as follows. Okay.
Right.
The thing that sort of binds both the Sunni jihadists as well as the followers of Khomeini are notions of what they call on the Sunni side takfir, which is that there are different rules for believing Muslims, and then that allows us to do everything else from murder to lying to stealing to the people who aren't among the believers. The notion of takfir is extremely important if you look at the sort of ideological history back to Qutb of Bin Laden and Al Qaeda, and there is a similar kind of parallel notions within the Khomeini strain of like the Twelver Shiism, and
right.
And I think the notion of supremacism sort of places them, I think, in the proper context of people who sort of seek to impose their will on others who don't necessarily believe, have a very kind of view of the world that treats different communities unequally. And in many ways, the idea that Al Qaeda was attacking first-time voters in Iraq in 2004, or rather 2005, I should say. And kind of committing terrorism against people and trying to deprive them of their right to vote, very much in the tradition of Jim Crow and the Ku Klux Klan and white supremacists and other sort of supremacists. So I think that that's a sort of more accurate term, and I sort of grant that fascism has ceased to have any meaning, as George Orwell said. It just means things that you don't agree with.
Right.
I think it's better to call them Islamic supremacists. And I think it's important to make sure that we do two things in how we name the enemy. One, we should recognize that it's clearly not all the Muslims. In fact, it's probably a small minority of Muslims really who are dedicated terrorists. And we should see it as this ideological war. But at the same time, we cannot sort of deny that there is this important Islamic component to it, because by just saying we're at war with terrorists, it's sort of like saying we're at war with sneak attacks or we're at war with submarines. I mean, it's ridiculous.
Right.
So,
I mean, it's a war against tactic, and I'm not one usually to credit Doug Feith with having anything to say, but I mean, he once did make the comparison of war on terrorism with war with dueling, right? I mean, it's a war in order to make a particular tactic unthinkable, and that makes a little bit of sense to me. But all the other problems with the idea of the war on terror make a lot less sense to me.
What's worth? I mean, and plus, I don't think America has like a national security interest in wiping out like the ETA movement.
Right. And if you were to apply some of the same logics to that we apply to, say, Iran, to U.S. support, and I don't want to sort of create a big thing about Iran specifically releasing it right now, but if the pro-terrorist, pro-IRA links in Boston in the 1980s or 1970s, right? I mean, where you have money flowing to people who are clearly Irish terrorists, but.
And also, by the way, it's also very useful in terms of the Israel-Palestinian dispute, because Hamas are Islamic supremacists. That's like at the core of what they believe. They're not Palestinian nationalists, and I think it's a real mistake to think that they are Palestinian nationalists in some ways, because a lot of what Hamas at least sort of says theologically is that like Palestine is just one of many provinces or sort of emirates of a large caliphate. That's the opposite of what I understood and what most Palestinians understood to be Palestinian nationalism, which is largely a secular movement.
Right. And I mean, I think you probably have a better grasp on the theology than myself. But I mean, one thing I would caution against in saying, well, we should say we're a war against Islamic terrorists or Islamic supremacists or whatever, rather than terrorists in general. And that it makes a little bit more sense to me anyway. But I'm not sure that it's really that easy to take sort of foundational aspects of a faith and then derive policy from them. And the example I would have here is that, yes, Islam does have this differentiation, right, that Muslims are treated differently than others. But
but I mean, most Muslims, though, don't aren't obsessed with it the way that
well, they're not obsessed,
bureaucrats
but it's part of the faith. But the actual
Right.
but it has, my point is that it has multiple different actual policy effects. And so you would have, for example, in the 18th and 19th century, where Orthodox Christians and Catholics would actually prefer living under the Sultan than living under their opposites, right, in the Balkans, because the policy implications of this Islamic belief were that Christians were treated differently, but they were treated differently in a tolerated sense that neither Orthodox nor Catholicism had. Right, and so it was actually more dangerous for a Catholic to live under an Orthodox and vice versa than it was to live under the Ottoman Sultan. And that's one potential policy implication of this understanding in Islamic theology. Right, and another possible implication is what you're describing, but the elements of theology aren't determinative of policy.
Let me put it another way. I don't think modernity can accommodate this 8th century violent movement. I just don't think the modern world doesn't have that right now. We don't really have. I mean, Greek Orthodox don't have that dilemma at this point because there's been quite a bit of upheaval, and a lot of the world has accepted, at least in sort of the language, or at least in aspiration, the basics of liberal democracy. And it's not to say that we need everybody to be a liberal democracy all at once. I've certainly given up on the notion that you can invade any country to make them democratic at this point, and I think that there are other things the international community can do that are effective. But I would say that you're fighting a movement that does seek indeed to gain territory. They're imperialistic themselves, and to impose this notion on others. What's more, when they exist in societies that are not sort of adhering to what they see as the sort of proper delineations of takfir, they take it upon themselves to throw acid in the face of unveiled women and so forth.
Right, but I think we're talking about even among sort of people we might conceive of as where Islam is very much politically relevant to them. I still think we're talking about a tiny minority, even if that's subset of the Islamic world. And we had a guy in here not long ago, a guy named Jeremy Jones, and he talked about the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, which has a whole set of really retrograde beliefs about democracy and all these, and the role of women in society and so forth. But they also, and he made this point, represent the only space for mobilizing against the authoritarian Egyptian state, which is why they're so popular. And
only
they
viable,
also,
right,
the only viable. And they also happen to cover a very wide portion of the most Western looking in terms of economic, in terms of markets, portions of Egyptian society. Like they do very, very well among those, an economic strata that is deeply tied into globalization, that is deeply connected with the world economy, in terms of not just everyday shopkeepers, but people who depend on the existence of globalization. And I think that's almost a little bit reassuring, right? That these groups are tied to this, and you can talk about, is liberalization in terms of democracy and economic liberalization, are they necessarily the same thing? They're connected in some fashion, and I think it's reassuring that, at least in Egypt, they're connected to what we'd otherwise consider these most retrograde parts of the Egyptian
a couple of things.
polity.
I lived in Egypt, and I was there for when the Muslim Brotherhood participated in the parliamentary elections in 2005. And what I would say is that first of all, unlike the Qaedocrats, they are all in favor of elections, and that's a huge distinction. Secondly, they have moderated to the point where they're criticized viciously by their former kind of adherents. Like Ayman al-Zawahiri, who is an Egyptian, Saif al-Adil has also sort of hates the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood, and the vice president, the Sunni vice president in Iraq, is a member of the I guess Iraqi Muslim Brotherhood. So I think that the Ikhwan movement or the Muslim Brotherhood movement is really different than what I would say is sort of the hardcore takfir ideology, though. I would also say that I would bet over time that the Muslim Brotherhood loses, and they will lose if there are more political options on offer for Egyptians and Syrians, or I think that they win when they are they become the magnet for any political activity against the authoritarian regime, because there's nothing else that survives. Because the Muslim Brotherhood is founded as a secret organization and can survive in authoritarian states, whereas some of the other Arab
right, it survives because it's the only thing that can survive
right.
in the context of the Egyptian state. No, I mean that's true.
But but that's my point is I don't want we do not want to get in a situation where there's another attack. Mm-hmm. And Americans just say, okay, that's it, we're at war with Islam, let's bomb Mecca. That's a disaster. I say this as somebody, I guess, coming from the right side of it. Mm-hmm. But you also don't want to get in a situation where you pretend, as Bush sort of does, that there is, we're not going to solve the inner problem necessarily within Islam, and why are we pronouncing what's more Islamic or not Islamic? What we should say is, listen, there is a group of subset of Muslims that believe that there is called to God to try to kill us and impose their will. This is what their political plan is, and this is who we're at war with. And right now we should be discreet about it. And this is a great way to kind of get into our next topic, which is Pakistan. Right now, the Takfirocrats or the Islamic supremacists mm-hmm. run the federal administered tribal areas in Pakistan on the border with Afghanistan in the Peshawar Valley. They basically got that country. You know what I'm saying? At various times, their adherents had Sudan. Briefly, they had Afghanistan. On the Shia side, they pretty much are running Iran. So we should be clear about it. We should say, this is what they. This is.
See,
what
I mean,
have.
And here's, I get, I still think, I think you're drawing the, you're creating an entity here that doesn't exist. And we'll set aside the distinction, and I think you already have set aside the distinction, obviously, between what you call the Islamic supremacists and your more run-of-the-mill authoritarian state that happens to be in an Islamic country. But I don't know. I see a big difference between the people in Iran and their understanding of the global situation between the people in the Taliban and the people in the Peshawar Valley. I think they have a very different understanding of what it means to act appropriately in the international system.
Do you think Iran is? How is Iran acting appropriately?
I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that Iran is acting appropriately. I'm saying that their vision of acting appropriately is much different than what you'll find in tribal Waziristan and what you'll find with the Taliban, right? And this is this became clear back in 2000 when Iran and Afghanistan almost went to a war, in part because Iran was acting and expected Afghanistan to act like a normal country. Right. This is when the Afghanis,
when they killed a bunch of their
right, and the distinction between how the Taliban understood internationally appropriate behavior and how the Iranians understood internationally appropriate behavior, which was much closer to how you would expect a Western country to understand how to act appropriately on the international stage. There was a tremendous difference between these two understandings of international behavior. And this is not to say that all of Iran's behavior is appropriate, but there is, I think, a big distinction between how they think they can act and how Peshawar Valley and Waziristan and so forth think that they can act.
Well, a couple things. One, there certainly were figures within Iran, like President Khatami, who attempted to have Iran sort of join the world. And those people were crushed by... I don't want to call them. The hardliners or the sort of the people who really run the country. But the other part of that story is that while the Iranians sort of helped us in Afghanistan, they also they never quite. There's a long story about the Qaeda leaders who went to Iran, but basically there was at one point a negotiation to try to swap the Mujahideen Corps for the senior Al-Qaeda leaders in Iran, mm-hmm. But then, as I understand it, it's been reported by a lot of folks, not just me, there was evidence that the people who were supposedly under house arrest had been, caught literally, sort of on the phone planning the 2003, I think, May attacks in Riyadh with Al-Qaeda cells. And they've sort of hosted or tolerated, and I can tell you there are other jihadist groups. The group that calls themselves now Al-Qaeda in Kurdistan, which came from Ansar al-Islam, became Ansar al-Sunnah, back to Ansar al-Islam, is hosted by the Iranians. I've reported they're given what are called political refugee cards by their MOIS and the Revolutionary Guard. I don't think, by the way, because they both Shia and Sunni fundamentalists believe that eventually they're going to have to kill each other, that they're working hand in hand and that they're the same entity. I think it's an alliance very much of convenience at this point. But I would also say that the Iranians have, unlike any state before it, sort of built almost a military entirely based on terrorism. The Revolutionary Guard and its Quds Force are terrorist entities, basically, or they train terrorists, they enable terrorism, and they use terrorism as statecraft more so than any other state, that we know of, I guess, in history. So, on the one hand, yes, I think that they, Ali Larijani will meet with the Europeans, or used to meet with the Europeans, now it's the new guy, and they pretend, on the one hand, to sort of be a normal nation, but on the other hand, they work to undermine international law, particularly on the most important, maybe the most important thing international law's got to deal with right now, which is terrorism. And they use terrorism as statecraft. They've done it all throughout the entire world. Whether it's the Argentinian court, sort of finding the highest levels of their government involved in the AMIA Cultural Center bombing in '94, whether it's attempting to assassinate the Prince of Bahrain. You could go through the list, and they have a kind of alliance of convenience with the Sunni side as well. So.
Right, and some questions can be asked. Well, is this how much of this is driven by this particular Islamic supremacist, and how much of it is driven by Iran's particular position in the international system? Its pariah position in the international system, and it's a pariah for a reason, because it behaves inappropriately. But given that it's a pariah, it has to continue behaving inappropriately in order to pursue its goals. Right? I mean, there's sort of a trap there. But And I guess this is the other problem. I mean, even if you you decide to identify both the Shia in Iran as enemies and the Sunnis in Waziristan and these places and the Taliban and so forth as enemies, why develop a language of conflict here that is most likely to unite our enemies rather than divide our enemies? I mean, it seems like part of the point of developing tools for fighting war is the division of those people from one another. And it seems like your understanding of how to talk about this, you want to unite these together. That makes a little sense to me.
Well, I think it's important, though, for clarity, because I think it's important for our republic. You know what I'm saying? It's important for there needs to be a consensus, I think, between right and left on the basics of the war, just like there was after the 1948 election. Wallaceism was sort of cast aside. Truman won, improbably, and pretty much the disagreement was on tactics between right and left and Democrats and Republicans. But everybody knew that the Soviet Union was expanding and it was an enemy, and that was how it was going to be. It wasn't like, we've been demonizing Stalin, which is sort of what Wallace was saying. And I think that there needs to be, I've detected this demonizing Iran stuff, and I think there needs to be some clarity, and it's important to sometimes show that there is a sort of similarity. The tactics used by Al-Qaeda, kind of got their start in Lebanon by Ahmad Mughniya, who, was a Shia, former 417 guy who ended up kind of being the founder of Hezbollah.
You know more about this than I do. Yeah. You know more about a lot of this than I do, but I'm not sure. I mean, what the relation to or the description of 1948 is supposed to do for us, because
it's the point of we need a consensus on who the enemy is.
Right, but who doesn't believe that Al Qaeda is the enemy? Right, and even farthest left, you'll probably find some people who think that Iran has the right to do whatever it does. But most people on the left don't think that Iran is an admirable society, and don't think that Iran does admirable things in the international system.
It's not about whether you like Iran or not, but I think that there's most people on the left, most Democrats, forget the left, think that the neocons are demonizing Iranian behavior, and that Petraeus, I remember reading Petraeus is a neocon because he was, and Ryan Crocker, of all people, I know Ryan Crocker from back in the day, when they would speak plainly about what the Iranians were doing to our soldiers in Iraq, it was that must be a sham. A lot of people believe that there was a serious 2003 offer, which is just, come on, that's absurd. There was this fax to Tim Goldeman and stuff. Come on. So that the Bush administration blew it. We could have had, Iran as this ally. And I just think that that's the problem is that by the way, if if there was somebody in Iran who emerged, okay, who was serious and there was a stop in their behavior and so forth, at least we're seeing now fewer weapons, I guess, getting to trained agents.
Well, they backed
in Iraq.
They backed off at this point.
Yeah, right.
But I mean, in terms of the weapons, I've never understood the weapons. I never thought the weapons were a specific effort by the army or Petraeus to demonize Iran. I mean, I thought it was bureaucratic move by the army to explain why they were losing, right? And now that they're not losing in the same way as they were, there's less of a need to make these claims about it. And I think those the sort of the border arguments are exactly the same ones you heard, in 1968. That only if we can invade, I think there's a long history of making those kinds of claims. But yeah, you have to. I mean, I guess this is why so many people see the demonization in the same sense as you saw with Iraq, because whatever went on with the intelligence agencies publicly, neoconservatives publicly, they were making claims about Iraq that were completely unsupportable, right? Claims about the threat that Iraq. Sure.
A lot of people,
yep.
Right? Yeah.
You're right, and there were some claims from people who are on the left too, which are also similarly completely unsupportable, right? And you look at North Korea and sort of claims that are made about North Korea's behavior, which is also inappropriate in a number of different ways. But I think we have rather dramatically demonstrated that North Korea can actually be talked to once you finally
I don't know how much faith
talk
you
to
have
them.
in this latest agreement, but okay.
Right, and it's. I'm not even one who goes in for, sort of your more outlandish conspiracy, but the rhetoric seems very similar to me.
The rhetoric, I don't have a problem with that. It depends on what you want to say to the Iranians. I mean, I guess if talking to the Iranians ended up meaning accepting their right to enrich uranium, then I would have a huge problem with that. But if talking to the Iranians was like, I don't know, I would love to send Michael Ledeen to Iran and have him lay down the law and say, hey, listen, this is how it's going to be. Sure. Or whoever, you know what I'm saying? But it's sort of what you're going to say.
Dictating is not talking, though. Lay down the law for how it's going to be. Dictating is not talking. Countries have different interests. They're going to pursue those interests.
Right, but I'm saying that they can't, Robert, the notion that, there's an option to letting these current people in charge. And I want to make it very clear, not the Persians, okay? Not the Persians. It's the current people in charge. Just like, I don't really like Musharraf that much, but the fact that Pakistan's got nukes and there's a risk if he falls, that you know what I'm saying? We don't have a lot of options. So we can't allow people, or Khomeinists or Islamic supremacists get nuclear weapons. That would be a real disaster. And it just strikes me that that's not based on intelligence. That's based on what they do. That's based on the fact that, they haven't come clean to the IAEA despite the statements of Mohammed al-Baradei. The IAEA itself has not pronounced given them a clean bill of health or closed the file. And they continue to enrich uranium despite 2 UN Security Council resolutions. And now, unlikely chance that there's another one.
But they're also sensitive to costs.
What? Well, that's what I'm saying. If that's ideal, right? If they were sensitive to costs, and they very well might be sensitive to costs. But I'm saying that the left, in particular the netroots and the net left, have seen the entire drama in terms of how do we stop Cheney and the neocons from doing something against Iran, and not wow, there's this Iranian bad behavior. What are the ways that we make sure they don't get a nuke?
But this is a simple value judgment. It's a very simple value judgment, and people on the left, and I am in considerable agreement with them, believe that whatever issue there may be with Iran, and in particular with its nuclear program, that war is an inappropriate way and probably an unproductive way of dealing with it. Right? That's the basic question.
Nobody's saying we should invade Iran. That's not on the table. There's some people who are in the pundit world much more than they are in the administration who've said that we should bomb Iran. I'm not in the bomb camp yet, and I've gone over this on other blog ads. But and so in some ways it was sort of like this once again, we know they're going to do it, even though Bush was saying options are on the table, but right now this is the diplomatic strategy, and so what I'm saying is that I don't think that there was a sense that the threat of Iran getting a nuke was a serious high order priority. There was actually a higher order priority, which is to stop the neocons. By the way, there's no neocons left. That's another surprise. There's no neocons left. They're all gone.
And that might be fair. I think, and here's my belief, and I'll lay it out very straight for you. Iranian nuclear weapons are better than war against Iran.
Okay, but like when you say war against Iran, I mean, first of all, given the fact that they only, if all these reports are told, recently stopped killing our soldiers in Iraq, and we sanction the hell out of them and encourage other banks to, with sort of a financial war. I mean, like, it's sort of like, come on, what are we saying here? When you say war, do you mean an invasion? I think I would agree with you. I don't think America should invade Iran, okay? But if you just mean a state of war, well, talk to the Iranians. I mean, they've been in a state of war technically with us since 1979.
Right. I mean, this is, yeah.
So I'm just saying, like, what? That's sort of, what do you mean? I just like, hey, I don't think the Mad Mullah should get a nuke.
Mm-hmm. In terms of using force against Iran for the specific reason of destroying Iran's nuclear program. And here's the thing, on questions of legitimacy, I may even be a little bit closer to you, but what I'm worried about is effectiveness, right? And effectiveness sort of leads to legitimacy, because if what you're proposing to do is completely ineffective and yet it still has costs, then it becomes illegitimate, right? Losing wars is immoral if you know you're going to lose them. And I just don't see a point A to B in terms of, even not invasion, but even airstrikes against Iran actually changing Iran's behavior in this way. These sort of attacks that are sub-invasion, but that a lot of people have talked about, and people have talked about them on both sides in terms of what airstrikes could do in Iran, that those sorts of attacks are going to be simply ineffective in terms of the long-term bringing of Iran into the international system.
Well, if the assumption is that the airstrikes would not hit everything because we don't know where everything is, right?
That's part of it.
And then I would also add to that, if you want to get all the negatives on the airstrikes, there's that plus, as badly as the Iranian liberal opposition is treated now, they would be treated far worse after that attack, though. I don't know. It seems to be that it's pretty bad right now, and they didn't need airstrikes to treat them badly. And under Clinton, they did bad things to the Iranians.
Well, but it's modulated. It goes up and down, and it goes up and down in part, not entirely, because Iran has its own political internal dynamics that matter for this. But it goes back and forth in part based on American behavior.
Right. And the other thing is, of course, they're master terrorists, the Iranians, and they will respond with terrorism, likely, or we would expect a response to terrorism. In Iraq, in Lebanon, possibly Israel, and maybe even North America. Mm-hmm. So there's this risk of how do you prepare for to counter the terrorists, and and you're waiting, and that's a bad situation as well. So those are all negatives, and that's why I'm not in the Norman Podhoretz camp of bomb them yesterday. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, if there was a sense that they were pretty close to having enough fissile material, or they were very close, and there's no way that we can know this because this is all sort of in the shadows.
Right.
And I think that
our beliefs about this should at least be modified by the latest NIE. Right.
But
on these questions.
That NIE. I mean, what the NIE was what is that, Robert? Come on. I mean, you have to believe that the Natanz program is
an indication that they don't have, as advanced of an atomic program as we thought.
Well, but what it said was that they had a program from 88 to 2003, which they halted. Their word, not mine, whatever that means. Okay, and that somehow magically the enrichment of uranium, which was part of their undeclared program before, which is to say that they had Bushehr, which the IAEA knew about. But they declared it, and that was all sort of fine, but they didn't declare this other enrichment activity at Natanz. We found out about it in 2003. They restarted in 2006 or 2005 the enrichment of uranium. 2006.
We shouldn't get bogged down.
We shouldn't get bogged down. I'm just saying that in order to believe that they've halted their nuclear weapons program, you have to believe the enrichment in Natanz is not for a nuclear weapon.
Can we just say that the NIE makes the argument that they're about to that they are on the verge of nuclear weapons a trifle less compelling, and then go on with your point.
Anyway, but I would argue that it actually the other way. But I guess we should probably. I guess we're going to agree to disagree on this point. But I guess my point on the bombing is that if it got to the point where there are known facilities that are spinning centrifuges right now, and we knew that they were very close, or that they were about to break out, or they were close to this point where they would have enough nuclear fuel, then I would say that as the clock ticks, then I could say yes, if you could prevent them, because it seems like the declared programs are pretty substantive as they are, and it would set them back enough, even though there would be these other consequences. But of course, there are consequences to any kind of action like that. And that's my caveat on the bombing, just to say that.
Right. I mean, and as you point out, there are consequences to no action at all. Right. I mean,
right. Which is to say, I'm pretty concerned. I wouldn't want them to get a nuclear weapon. It would be really bad for a lot of reasons. I mean, proliferation-wise, it would really be bad.
Right. And I'm strongly in favor of the various. Maybe we should talk a little about the Israeli strike on Syria. We're out of time, or pretty close to out of time. But,
okay. Well, before we go, I actually want to sort of. Why don't you summarize for the viewers the very provocative piece that you wrote for the American Prospect on the Air Force?
Oh, that's right, the Air Force. It was titled "Abolish the Air Force," which was kind of aggressive. But the argument that I was making was that the Air Force, the United States Air Force, is a bureaucratic entity that should never have been created. That was created based on a misunderstanding of how wars actually fought, and that it should be folded back into the entity that it used to be part of, which is the United States Army. Right. Which I think has a much more compelling vision of how wars ought to be conducted than the modern United States Air Force. Okay. So that's in a nutshell.
In a nutshell. But you also kind of got into what I thought was something I agreed with, which is that the Air Force, not exactly the best instrument in a war against networks of terrorists. And I totally agree.
Right, and the airstrike, and when you use the term imprecise, to an Air Force person they'll say, well, look, our weapon can hit within 1 foot, which means it can blow up individual buildings in whatever town you're deciding that you need to bomb. But you don't know who's in those buildings.
Right. I mean, and it depends on the actionable intelligence.
Right, exactly.
Right.
And so yes, that it's particularly bad in terms of the sort of wars that we're fighting now and that we're likely to fight in the future. But one of the critiques I've got is I don't mention China at all in this, and people are saying, well, we need the Air Force because of China, and I think the critique of the Air Force is just as effective when you're talking about China as when you're talking about a counterinsurgency conflict.
Have you read a book by Robert Pape called Bombing to
Win? Yes.
Great book.
It's a fantastic book.
Really explicit, and it's not too jargony.
No. It's
not a foreign policy professor or anything.
Yeah, so definitely.
I read it, and you can get a lot of it. But here's an interesting thing: is that we don't have an Air Force to we talk about it now because we have these really precise weapons that the Air Force can hit the building with the I don't know, like the secret anthrax lab or something.
Right.
But in fact, the real reason why we have bombing at all is because it comes out of artillery and catapults. It's a way of sanctioning somebody. It's just a way of if you don't let us into your city so we can take it over, we're going to just keep lobbing fiery whatever or stones and start doing all this stuff. And it's basically a form of sanction. And the question is, when you're dealing with I would say terrorist entities that actually thrive on chaos and thrive when social services and electricity and water supplies break down, they
thrive on the disintegration of the state.
They thrive on the disintegration of the state. You may be doing their job for them, but also Saddam Hussein proved during the sanction years that if you're a dictator and you rule by utter fear and terror and you don't care about your population, then that's another example. It's like, that it's the notion that it really bombing only works unless you're dealing with a country, I guess, like China, that really does care about its population.
Right. Well,
and is susceptible to pressures from the population.
The argument that Pape made was that incinerating all these German and Japanese civilians meant absolutely nothing to the authoritarian regimes that ran Germany and Japan. Right. That where bombing worked and where air power works is destroying the military capability of the enemy. And once you destroy the military capability of the enemy, that's the trick, right? You've won the war.
Right, but I'm saying that we've so many so many projectile explosives that it's just sort of an interesting notion. Now, I think the doctrine now for the Air Force is that they've sort of figured some of this stuff out. But yes and no, though, right? I mean, so anyway, it's an interesting concept.
Right.
I thought it was a very provocative piece, and I did not know any of that history about the Air Force and the Army. So I would commend even our 4 conservative Blogging Heads TV viewers to read it, even though it's the American Prospect. I know. Do
liberals watch Blogging Heads? Who does watch? I don't really know.
God, no. Marxists in their pajamas, literary theory PhDs. That's who's watching. I can tell you that. Hey, good talking to you, Robert.
Yeah, you too.
Okay, take care.
All right, bye-bye.